Alcatraz, the most infamous prison in the United States, sits on a lonely island in the middle of San Francisco Bay. Long before the prison was built, Native Americans believed the island was home to evil spirits. Decades later, the U.S. government came to a similar conclusion. A small fortress on a rocky island, surrounded by sheer cliffs, open visibility, and total isolation, Alcatraz was the perfect place to keep men who couldn't be trusted with freedom. It was said that no one could ever escape, but one day, 3 desperate inmates proved otherwise. Frank Morris, Clarence Anglin, and John Anglin remain, to this day, the only prisoners known to have broken out of Alcatraz and vanished without a trace. Until the mid-19th century, the structure on Alcatraz Island served as a military fortress guarding the bay. In the 1850s, the U.S. Army stationed cannons there to protect San Francisco from those swept up in the California gold rush and built the first operating lighthouse on the U.S. West Coast. But the island never fired a single shot in defense. Within a decade, it was turned into a military prison. During the Civil War, Union forces used the Rock to hold Confederate prisoners. In the 1860s, military convicts began arriving as well. By the 1910s, the U.S. Army had developed it into a fully equipped military facility. Then, in 1933, the island was transferred to the Department of Justice, which reinforced the old fortress and transformed it into a maximum security federal penitentiary. In the gangster era of the 1930s, Alcatraz became the most secure prison in America, a place for the most violent and notorious criminals in the country. Thick concrete walls, reinforced steel bars, and mechanical cell doors were designed to make escape impossible. The location itself was the perfect deterrent. Surrounded by freezing, fast-moving waters and treacherous tides, there was nowhere to run. For that reason, Alcatraz became home to inmates considered too dangerous or too escape-prone for other prisons. The distance from the island to the mainland is only about 1.5 miles, but strong currents, biting winds, sharks, and icy waters, around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10-12 graus Celsius, even in summer, made escape nearly suicidal. Yet some still tried. Over the years, more than 36 men attempted 14 separate escapes. 23 were caught, 7 were shot dead, and 3 drowned. The fate of 5 others remains a mystery. 2 prisoners who escaped in 1937 were officially declared dead, likely swept beneath the waves of the bay. But the trio who fled in 1962, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, might have actually made it. They could have reached the shore and lived out their days in freedom, far from the clang of steel doors and the gray skies of Alcatraz. The FBI eventually closed its investigation, declaring the men deceased, but the U.S. Marshals Service still lists their case as open. When it was first conceived, Alcatraz was meant to be an idealistic experiment, a place to isolate the most incorrigible prisoners in the federal system and to demonstrate the government's determination to end the crime wave of the 1920s and 1930s. The prison was never filled to its maximum capacity of 336 inmates. On average, it held around 275. Turning Alcatraz into a prison was controversial from the start. The facility was small, lacked fresh water, and could be reached only by boat. Everything, food, fuel, medicine, had to be brought in by barge. Maintaining the prison cost nearly 3 times as much as any other federal facility. In 1959, housing 1 inmate on Alcatraz cost about $10 a day, roughly $106 in today's money. By comparison, at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, the same cost was just $3 a day, or about $31 adjusted for inflation. With no natural water supply, nearly 1 million gallons of fresh water had to be shipped in every week. Eventually, the government concluded that keeping Alcatraz open simply wasn't worth it. It would be cheaper to build an entirely new prison than to continue operating the Rock. If the prison had remained in operation, the crumbling island fortress would have required a massive restoration project, costing around $5 million at the time, or more than $50 million in today's money. That, ultimately, was the final straw. After just 29 years of operation, Alcatraz was shut down for good. Over 1,500 inmates served time on the Rock, men considered too violent, too dangerous, or too unpredictable to be kept anywhere else. Among them were the legendary gangster Al Capone and fellow mobsters Mickey Cohen and George Machine Gun Kelly, the same man whose nickname later inspired the stage name of the rapper Machine Gun Kelly. Prisoners were stripped of their names and given numbers. Speaking to other inmates was forbidden, and any minor infraction could land them naked and alone in solitary confinement, a lightless cell that drove many to the brink of insanity. The brutal conditions broke even the hardest men. After a few years behind its walls, Al Capone himself confessed, "Alcatraz has broken me." As early as 1939, only a few years after the prison opened, the U.S. Attorney General called it an incubator of resentment and brutality. By the mid-20th century, America's correctional philosophy had begun to shift from punishment to rehabilitation. In its 29 years of existence, every escape attempt but one ended in failure. Alcatraz was, in every sense, an impenetrable fortress. That reputation would finally be shattered in 1962, when three men managed to slip out of their cells, vanish into the night, and make history. Frank Lee Morris arrived at Alcatraz in January 1960. Born in Washington state, he was orphaned by age 11 and bounced between foster homes until his first arrest at 13. He spent most of his life behind bars for robbery, drug possession, and repeated escape attempts, but one detail stood out in his file: his intelligence. According to federal records, Frank Lee Morris had an IQ of 133. For reference, a score of 90 to 109 is average, 110 to 119 is above average, and anything over 130 is found in only about 2% of the population. Morris was sent to the Rock after escaping from a Louisiana prison where he'd been serving 10 years for bank robbery. He was eventually caught committing another burglary and transferred to the most secure prison in the country, sentenced to 14 years. On January 18, 1960, at age 33, he became inmate AZ-441. He began planning his early release on his very first day inside. Sharing the same cell block were two brothers, John and Clarence Anglin, born into a poor farming family in Georgia. Neither had much education. One left school after 3rd grade, the other after 5th. They'd made a career out of robbing banks, cars, and small businesses, drifting from state to state and prison to prison. Escape attempts were their trademark. They even tried to break out of Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas. John Anglin arrived at Alcatraz on October 24, 1960, at age 30, inmate AZ-1476, and Clarence followed on January 10, 1961, at age 29, inmate AZ-1485. The fourth man in their block was Allen West, another seasoned thief who'd been arrested more than 20 times. After serving time for auto theft in Atlanta, he attempted an escape from a Florida prison in 1957, was caught, and sent to Alcatraz at age 28 as inmate AZ-335. All four men already knew each other from previous stints behind bars, so when they chatted quietly at night, no one thought much of it. Guards assumed they were just reminiscing about old times. In reality, the four were plotting what would become one of the most legendary escapes in American history. Their plan took shape over many months. Morris was the mastermind. The Anglin brothers and West were his engineers. Using stolen cafeteria spoons, they spent night after night chiseling away at the concrete around the ventilation grates beneath their sinks. To speed up the work, they built a homemade drill, fashioned from a vacuum cleaner motor and old saw blades. With improvised tools, they slowly widened the vents behind their cells. To mask the noise, Morris played his accordion in the evenings, a privilege he'd earned through music hour. The holes were hidden behind cardboard painted to match the cell walls. Eventually, the men gained access to an unguarded utility corridor behind their cells, which led upward to an unused service area above the cell block. That's when Phase 2 began, building a raft. The men stitched together more than 50 stolen raincoats, sealing the seams using heat from the steam pipes. They'd learned how to make a rubber raft from an issue of Popular Mechanics found in the prison library. Their air pump was an accordion. They carved paddles out of scrap wood and made life vests from raincoats as well. Piece by piece, they built their escape route right under the noses of the guards. The final step was deception. The men needed time, a head start before the guards realized they were gone. They worked on the raft only at night. While they were sneaking through tunnels and climbing pipes, their empty bunks had to look occupied. so they crafted remarkably lifelike dummy heads, masterpieces of prison ingenuity, made from soap, toilet paper, and real hair collected from the barbershop floor. Each head was painted to match their skin tone and even had the right hair color. On the night of the escape, the dummies were placed on their pillows, while towels and folded clothes created the illusion of sleeping bodies. If everything went right, the guards would pass by without suspecting a thing, giving the trio enough time to cross the bay before the alarm was raised. On the night of June 11th, 1962, everything was ready. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers slipped through their holes and vanished into the darkness. Alan West, who couldn't remove his vent cover in time, was left behind. The three men crawled through a service corridor, climbed up a kitchen vent shaft, reached the roof, and descended a 50-foot wall. They scaled 2 barbed wire fences, reached the shoreline, inflated their rubber raft, and disappeared into the cold waters of San Francisco Bay. No one ever saw them again. The Anglin brothers had an advantage. They were strong swimmers. Growing up near Florida's Tampa Bay, they were used to cold water and unpredictable currents. They knew how to read the tides, and the key to survival was timing. Enter the water too early, and the current would drag them out to sea. But at 11 that night, the tide was shifting toward the mainland. Their one chance. The papier-mâché heads did their job flawlessly through the night. But by morning, the illusion collapsed, literally. At dawn on June 12, 1962, Correctional Officer Bill Long began his shift as usual, carrying his steel thermos of hot coffee up the steep hill toward the prison. After roll call, another guard came running toward him, shouting, "Bill, Bill, Bill, I've got a guy who won't get up for count." Long rushed to cell B-150, John Anglin's. He knelt by the bars, reached in to nudge the man's head, and it rolled off the pillow, hitting the floor with a hollow thud. Moments later, the sirens screamed. It was a piercing, horrible sound, recalled Jolene Babiak, the warden's daughter, who lived on the island with the families of the prison staff. I woke up terrified. My first thought was, an escape? No way. But it was real. The prison went into full lockdown. Cells and staff housing were searched from top to bottom, and a massive manhunt began. Investigators immediately questioned Alan West, who admitted he'd been part of the escape plan. He revealed that the group intended to reach Angel Island, about 2 miles from Alcatraz. But the island was thoroughly searched, and no trace of the fugitives was found. West, perhaps in exchange for leniency, cooperated fully and was never charged with attempted escape. 3 days later, police discovered a homemade paddle floating in San Francisco Bay. Then shreds of raincoats washed up on Angel Island. Soon after, a sealed rubber packet containing personal items belonging to the Anglins was found. A week later, pieces of a makeshift raft surfaced near the Golden Gate Bridge. Later still, a life vest was recovered. But there were no bodies, no footprints, no witnesses. In 1979, the FBI officially closed the case, declaring the escapees dead and transferring it to the U.S. Marshals Service. Morris and the Anglin brothers were listed among America's most wanted fugitives. When the film Escape from Alcatraz, starring Clint Eastwood as Frank Morris, premiered later that year, rumors exploded. Some claimed to have seen the men alive. Others swore they'd received letters and postcards from them. A popular theory emerged. The fugitives had made it to Brazil and disappeared into the crowd. According to reports, the Anglins' mother received Christmas cards every year after the escape. In 2018, the San Francisco police made public a letter they'd received 5 years earlier, allegedly written by John Anglin. It read, "I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962. Yes, we all made it that night, but barely." The letter claimed that Frank Morris had died in 2005 and Clarence Anglin in 2008. The writer said he was sick with cancer and wanted to surrender in exchange for treatment. The FBI examined the letter, but could not verify its authenticity. Then in 2020, headlines erupted. AI finds the missing Alcatraz escapees. Facial recognition software suggested that at least 2 of the men, John and Clarence Anglin, may have survived. Back in 2015, a family friend had released a photo allegedly showing the brothers in Brazil in 1975. At the time, no one could confirm it. But modern facial recognition algorithms using IdentV technology later matched the faces with 99.7% certainty. In 2022, 60 years after the escape, police released age-progressed sketches of the men and appealed to the public for information. The case remains open and will officially close only in 2031, when each of the fugitives would be 100 years old. If alive, they'd now be in their 90s. Many want to believe that Morris and the Anglins made it, that they reached the shores of South America and lived out their days in peace. The story endures because it's too perfect to let go, the ultimate triumph of human will against impossible odds. Even a single successful escape proves that the impossible can be done, with patience, intelligence, and courage. Not all attempts were as elaborate, but some were just as daring. In 1945, one inmate took advantage of the fact that Alcatraz handled laundry for West Coast military bases. Guards thought escape was impossible, so they trusted him to work on the docks unloading ships. Quietly, he began stealing one piece of clothing at a time until he had a complete military uniform. One day, dressed head to toe as a soldier, he hid on the dock and jumped aboard a departing boat. It almost worked, but within minutes, guards realized he was missing and radioed the vessel. The boat turned around, and the would-be escapee found himself back in his cell, with a story to tell for the rest of his life. Another near success came in 1962. One inmate spent almost a year working on a single window lock in a storage room, weakening it bit by bit with anything he could find. On the chosen day, he covered himself in lard to squeeze through the narrow opening, and it worked. He not only escaped from Alcatraz, but actually swam all the way to the mainland. Unfortunately, exhaustion got the better of him. He collapsed on the rocks near the Golden Gate Bridge and fell asleep, only to be woken up an hour later by the guards who promptly brought him back to the island. The mere fact that anyone could break out of the most secure prison in America shattered its reputation. Newspapers mocked the government, writing that steel and concrete were defeated by spoons. Less than a year later, on March 21, 1963, Alcatraz was officially closed. For years after the famous 1962 escape, the FBI and other law enforcement agencies searched for the missing men, dead or alive. Countless theories about their fate emerged. 17 years later, with no evidence and no trace of the fugitives, the Bureau was forced to close the case. Despite years of investigation, the FBI never found any sign of Frank Morris or the Anglin brothers. The official conclusion: they drowned in the bay. Yet no bodies were ever recovered near Alcatraz or Angel Island, leaving many experts unconvinced. Some believe the men pulled off the impossible. Dutch scientist Rolf Hutt, for example, analyzed the tidal patterns that night and concluded that the escapees could have made it to shore if they entered the water at precisely the right time. The true fate of the Alcatraz escapees remains a mystery, even 62 years later. Alcatraz, the maximum security prison with the fewest privileges in the country, operated for nearly 30 years before being shut down. The cost of maintaining the island was 3 times higher than any other federal facility. Today, the island is one of America's most visited landmarks. Over 1 million tourists come each year, many drawn by the legend of the Anglin brothers. John Anglin's old cell, the very one they escaped from, is now a highlight of every tour. It remains almost perfectly preserved, complete with the gaping hole in the turquoise wall. But even that piece of history offers no answers, only the enduring mystery of where the greatest escapees in American history went after vanishing into the cold waters of San Francisco Bay.